This month we're going to be making two different blocks. The first one is the Friendship Star, and for that block you have 3 rectangles that are somewhere around 4 by 10 that are going to be the star fabric, and then you also have 3 rectangles that are around 6 by 12 that are going to be our background fabric. From our star fabric we need 2 3 1/4 inch squares and 1 2.5 inch square. I actually have all 3 of my pieces for the star fabric stacked up. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. It makes you nervous. So I'm clean cutting 2 edges, and then I'm going to cut my strip down to 3 1/4 inches wide. So 3 1/4. And I'm going to cut off a 6 1/2 inch section. So I'm lining up the 6 1/2 inch mark with my short clean cut edge and any lines with my long edges, and cut. And then I'm going to back up to 3 1/4. So that gets me my 2 3 1/4 inch squares. And then from what's left, I need a 2 1/2 inch square. So I'm just going to line my 2 1/2 inch mark up on this edge and this edge. So my 2 clean cut edges. Cut and cut, and that takes care of my star fabric. For my background piece, I again have all 3 stacked up, and again, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. So I'm going to clean, again, like I always do, clean cut 2 edges to start. And then there is a mistake in the diagram on the pattern. If you look right here, there's no line for the 2 1/2 inch squares. You actually want to cut 4 2 1/2 inch squares, not a 2 1/2 inch rectangle. So you can draw the line in, or just realize that you need 4 squares. So I'm going to come down on the end, the short end that's clean cut. 2 1/2 plus 2 1/2 is 5. So I'm going to line up any line with this edge of my 5 inch mark with the short edge, and cut. And very carefully, since I have them stacked up, scoot this back. And then I'm going to cut this down to a 5 inch square. And then I'm going to cut it in half both directions. So I'm going to line up the 2 1/2 inch mark with one of the one side. It doesn't really matter since it's a square now. And cut, and then the 2 1/2 inch mark going the other way. And cut. And then out of what's left, I need 2 3 1/4 inch squares. So I'm going to line my 3 1/4 up with the long edge, any line with the short clean cut edge, so 3 1/4. This piece is scrap. I'm going to come back to 6 1/2 on my short edge and cut, and scoot it back to 3 1/4 and cut. And that gives me all my pieces for my Friendship Star. On the wrong side of your background squares that are 3 1/4 inches wide, you're either going to mark one line from point to point, and then so 1/4 inch away from that line, or if you're using the magic wand or a similar tool, you'll put the line in the tool on the opposite points and mark on both sides, and in that case you will stitch on your marked lines. So do that on the wrong side of your 3 1/4 background squares, all of them. You can pair your star fabric and your background fabric up any way you like, but this is how I'm doing it. So you're going to take your star fabric and your background fabric. You're going to put the background fabric right sides together with your star fabric, and we're going to go sew on our lines that are 1/4 of an inch from the center, whether that's sewing 1/4 of an inch away from your one line or sewing on your marked lines. After stitching our 2 lines of stitching 1/4 of an inch away from the center, we're going to cut those in half between the lines of stitching and then press toward the star fabric, so it would be toward the yellow on this one. Then all of these need to be trimmed down to 2.5 inches. So you can use just a regular square ruler. And if you're using a square ruler, you're just going to line up your diagonal line on that seam. You're going to make sure that you have fabric beyond the 2.5 inch mark and beyond the edges, and then cut 2 sides. And we're going to rotate, and now we're going to line up our 2.5 inch mark on our 2 cut edges, as well as the diagonal line on that center seam, and cut the remaining 2 sides. Okay, so that's trimming it with a square ruler. If you have the block lock ruler, you can use it, and on the back side of the block lock there's a groove cut in here, and that groove will ride right along your seam. Now be aware, it will ride along it this way too, but when we are going to trim down a square, we want to make sure that the point of our block lock is on the seam. Again, I'm making sure that there's fabric beyond the 2.5 inch mark and extending beyond the edges. Going to cut 2 sides, and I don't even have to pick the ruler up. I can just rotate, well, you really can, but, and then slide the ruler back. I'm going to move this for camera purposes so you can see. Slide the ruler back to my 2.5 inch mark here, and trim the remaining 2 sides. So you're going to trim all of your half square triangle units down to the 2.5 inches. Once all of our half square triangle units are trimmed down, then we're just going to sew this together into a 9 patch. So the half square triangle units are going in the centers on rows or columns, and you're going to need to look at the picture to make sure you have it turned the correct direction. We're just going to sew these together. My rows are sewn together, and my top and bottom row I pressed away from the center, and the center row is pressed in toward the center. So now it's just a matter of sewing the 3 rows together, and my match points are just where the seams are. Here are my 3 finished friendship stars. My last step after sewing the rows together was to press the seam in toward the center row. Our second block this month is the Churn Dash, and you have 6 rectangles of fabric in your kit that are all the same size. So you're going to use half of them for background and half of them for the block design. So you can choose if you want. I'm going to be using the light ones for the background. So I'm working again with all of my background stacked up together. So I have 3 pieces here. Again, you do not have to do that if you don't want to. You can do it 1 piece at a time. So the first thing I'm going to do is straighten up one long edge. And then I'm going to cut a 1.5 inch strip off that edge that I just clean cut. And I'm not worrying about straightening the short ends. The pattern says that it should be 11.5 inches long. Your rectangle should be a little bit longer than that, so don't worry about cutting it down. And then I need to cut 2 3.25 inch squares and 1 2.5 inch square. So 3.25 times 2 is 6.5, and I have not clean cut my short edge yet, so I'm going to leave a little bit extra there. So I'm going to go 3.25 by more than 6.5 down here on this edge so that I can clean it up. I have plenty here, so Okay, and then I want to cut this down to 6.5 inches. So I'm going to put my 6.5 on this edge that I just squared off when I cut it. So there, and any straight line along the long edges, and cut. And then I'm going to move back to 3 1/4. And cut. Sorry, I'm doing this awkward. I should have walked around. So that gives me my 2 3 1/4 inch pieces. And this one I would have rather not moved, but I'm okay. And I just need a 2.5 inch square from there. So I can line up my 2.5 inch mark here and here. Cut and cut, and the rest of this is scrap. My fabrics that I'm going to use for my churn dash part, not the background, I have them stacked up. Again, do them one at a time if you like. I'm going to cut a 1.5 inch strip off the long edge of this as well, so I'm going to clean cut one edge first. And walk around. And 1.5 along the long edge. And cut. And then in addition to that, I just need 2 3 1/4 inch squares. So I'm going to put the 3 1/4 along my long clean cut edge. 3 1/4 times 2 is 6.5. So I'm going to overcut because I haven't clean cut this one edge. And this is scrap. And I am going to walk around this time because it's just easier for cutting. I need to cut this rectangle down to 6.5. So I have my 6.5 on my short edge, any straight lines on my long. Cut, move my ruler back to 3 1/4 and cut. And that finishes our cutting for this block. So just like in the last block, on the back side of our background pieces, so the light pieces in this case, you can either draw one line, point to point, and then so 1/4 inch away from that line, or use a magic wand or similar tool, in which case you are putting your scored line or your center mark on the points and drawing on both sides of your tool, and then you will be stacking it up with whichever piece you are matching it up with for your churn dash, and so right sides together, and so along those lines, or 1/4 inch from your single center line. Once we've stitched our 2 lines of stitching, then we just need to cut these in half just like we did with the last block. And after you've cut them in half, we're going to press toward the dark, and then they need to be trimmed down to 2.5 inches, just like the last block. So I'm just going to do the square or the block lock this time. So trim, trim, rotate, slide back to the 2.5 inch mark right here, and trim. And you will trim all of the half square triangle units. Okay, once you have those done, then the next step is to sew your long strips together, and they should be the same pieces matching as they are in the half square triangle units along the long edge. Once the strips are sewn together, press toward the dark, and then we're going to cut 2.5 inch sections off of this. So your strip should be 2.5 inches wide if your 1/4 inch was accurate. So I'm going to clean cut one edge, walk around. I need 4 2.5 inch strips, so 4 times 2.5 is 10. I'm going to cut, slide back to 7.5. And I am lining up a line with my center seam as well as the outside edge. And then back to 5. Cut. And finally 2.5. And once that's finished, then we have all our sections and we just need to put our block together. So we have background in the center, and then dark is going up next to that. And I need to here and here. And the dark points in toward the center on my triangles. Okay, so I will take it to the sewing machine and sew it together in rows. So it would be this row and this row are the same, they're just flipped, and this row. My rows are sewn together, and the top and bottom row are pressed in toward the center, and the middle row is pressed away from the center. So now all that's left is to sew the rows together, and my only matching points are my seams, and they're going in opposite directions, so they should nest nicely. Once the rows are sewn together, then we press away from the center, and that finishes our churn dash block. And you will have 3 of these.